The howling wind carried her desperate prayers into nothingness as Eleanor clutched her daughter's freezing hand. Death stalked them through the blinding snow, patient, knowing they couldn't last another night. When the mountain man's shadow emerged from the whiteout, rifle raised, she had to choose certain death in the storm or surrender to a stranger's mercy. What happened next would bind their fates forever through a mountain tradition as old as winter itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Blue Ridge Mountains, North Carolina, winter of 1898. The mountains stood indifferent and merciless, buried beneath a December snow that fell without pause or pity. Cold wasn't something you felt here. It was something that hunted you, patient and calculating, waiting for the smallest mistake. Eleanor Foster had been walking for 2 days now, her boots soaked through, each step becoming heavier than the last. The mountain path had disappeared hours ago beneath the relentless white, forcing her to navigate by instinct and desperation alone. The valley below, which had seemed so close that morning, now felt like a cruel mirage. Twilight was approaching, fast, shadows deepening between the towering pines, temperature plummeting with each passing minute. Eleanor adjusted her threadbare shawl, more from habit than hope of warmth, and looked down at Grace. Her 8-year-old daughter's face had taken on a bluish tinge that made Eleanor's heart constrict with terror. The child's eyes, usually bright, with curiosity, had dulled, her steps becoming sluggish and uncertain. Grace hadn't complained in hours, and that silence frightened Eleanor more than any cry or whimper could have. "Just a little further, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, her voice swallowed by the wind. "We'll find shelter soon." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. There was no shelter to be found on this god-forsaken mountain, no cabin lights glimmering. Through the trees, no smoke rising to signal human presence. They were utterly alone. She pulled Grace closer, willing what little warmth remained in her own body to transfer to her daughter. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the small bundle of possessions slung across her shoulder. All that remained of their former life, a life that had crumbled around them with cruel efficiency following Matthew's death. Eleanor had known poverty before, had grown accustomed to its bitter taste during the years of Matthew's illness, but nothing had prepared her for the calculated cruelty of her brother-in-law, Richard. The memory surfaced unbidden, sharp and painful as a knife between her ribs. The modest farmhouse had never felt so cold as it had that night, 1 week after they'd laid Matthew in the frozen ground. Eleanor had been mending Grace's only dress by lamplight when Richard's heavy footsteps approached across the porch. He hadn't knocked, simply pushed open the door, Harriet trailing behind him like a thin shadow. "We need to talk about arrangements," Richard had said without preamble, his gaze sweeping critically around the small room as if already cataloguing its contents. Eleanor had set aside her sewing, careful to keep her voice steady for Grace's sake. "What arrangements?" "The farm. This house." Richard had cleared his throat, uncomfortable but determined. "It's family property, always has been." "Matthew was family," Eleanor had replied, something cold settling in her stomach. "Matthew's gone." The words had landed like stones. "And you, well, you were just his wife." Eleanor had risen slowly, conscious of Grace's wide eyes watching. From the corner, "This is our home. Matthew built it with his own hands. On Foster land," Richard had countered. "With Foster timber. Look, Eleanor, I'm not an unkind man, but times are hard for everyone. Harriet and I have our own children to think about." "What exactly are you saying, Richard?" Eleanor had asked, though she'd already known the answer. "You'll need to find other arrangements by the end of the week." The memory dissolved as Grace stumbled beside her, nearly falling face first into the snow. Eleanor caught her, heart hammering against her ribs. The child's skin felt cold as the snow beneath their feet, her eyes struggling to focus. "I'm tired, Mama," Grace whispered, the words slurring slightly. "Can't we rest just for a little while?" Eleanor knew what happened to people who rested in snowstorms. She'd seen it once as a girl. A trapper found sitting peacefully against a tree, looking for all the world as if he were merely sleeping. His eyes had been open, staring sightlessly at nothing, frost crystallizing on his lashes. "We can't stop, Gracie," she said, fighting to keep the desperation from her voice. "We have to keep moving." "Where are we going?" Grace asked, her small voice nearly lost in the howling wind. To her sister's home in Willow Creek, Eleanor had told herself for days. Sarah would take them in, would offer shelter and kindness. But the storm had disoriented her, pushed her off the main trail, and now Eleanor wasn't certain they were even heading in the right direction anymore. They might be wandering deeper into the wilderness with each step. "Somewhere safe," she answered, because it was the only truth that mattered now. The wind shifted suddenly, driving ice crystals against their faces like tiny knives. Eleanor turned her back to it, sheltering Grace with her body. That's when she saw it, a darker shadow against the white, the faint outline of what might be, a structure of some kind. Hope surged through her veins, lending strength to her frozen limbs. "Look, Gracie," she whispered, pointing toward the shadowy form. "I think I see a cabin." Grace didn't respond. Her eyes had fallen shut, her small body growing heavier against Eleanor's side. Panic clawed at Eleanor's throat as she shook her daughter gently. "Grace, you must stay awake." She patted the child's cheek, relief flooding through her when Grace's eyes fluttered open. There's shelter ahead, just a little further. Gathering Grace into her arms, Eleanor pushed forward, each step a battle against the deepening snow and her own exhaustion. The cabin, if indeed it was a cabin, and not some cruel trick of the fading light, seemed no closer after several minutes of struggle. Her lungs burned, the cold air like shards of glass with each desperate breath. Then she heard it, a low, menacing growl cutting through the constant howl of the wind. Eleanor froze, her arms tightening instinctively around Grace. Slowly, she turned. The wolf stood less than 10 yards away, its grey form nearly invisible against the snow and gathering darkness. Only its eyes gave it away, yellow and unblinking, fixed on her with predatory focus. It was gaunt, ribs visible beneath its winter coat. Hunger had driven it to boldness. Eleanor's mind raced. She had nothing, no weapon, no shelter, no strength. Left to run. The wolf took a step forward, muscles tensing beneath its thin frame. It knew weakness when it saw it, and Eleanor was weak, burdened with a child too exhausted to even recognize the danger. She lowered Grace gently to the ground, positioning herself between her daughter and the predator. If the wolf attacked, she would fight with whatever strength remained in her frozen limbs. She would lose, but perhaps buy enough time for someone, anyone, to find Grace before it was too late. The wolf crouched, preparing to spring. Eleanor braced herself, a prayer forming on her lips. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the moment, echoing across the mountainside like thunder. The wolf collapsed mid-lunge, its body hitting the snow. With a dull thud, mere feet from where Eleanor stood. For several heartbeats she couldn't move, couldn't process what had happened. Then slowly she turned toward the source of the shot. A man stood about 30 yards away, rifle still raised to his shoulder, the barrel smoking slightly in the frigid air. He was tall, broad-shouldered beneath a heavy bearskin coat, his face partially obscured by a full beard and the brim of a worn hat crusted with snow. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her with an intensity that made Eleanor instinctively step back. Finally, he lowered the rifle and approached, his movements cautious, deliberate, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden motion. As he drew closer, Eleanor could see his eyes, dark and assessing beneath heavy brows flecked with grey. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said, his voice rough from disuse, but not unkind. His gaze moved to Grace, huddled on the ground. Something shifted in his expression. The child needs shelter. It wasn't a question, but Eleanor nodded anyway, her voice barely functioning. "Please," she managed, the words scraping against her dry throat. "My daughter." The man's gaze remained on Grace for a moment longer, then returned to Eleanor. There was no warmth in his expression, but something like recognition flickered across his features, as if he understood exactly what had driven her to this desperate point. "My cabin's just beyond that ridge," he said, gesturing with a gloved hand. "Can you walk?" Eleanor nodded, though in truth she wasn't certain her legs would carry her much further. She bent to gather Grace into her arms, but the man stepped forward. "Let me," he said simply. When Eleanor hesitated, something like impatience crossed his face. "She's half frozen. We don't have time for pride." He was right, and Eleanor knew it. Reluctantly, she stepped aside. The man holstered his rifle and lifted Grace with surprising gentleness, cradling her against his chest. The child didn't stir, her face deathly pale against the dark fur of his coat. "Follow me," he said, already turning toward the ridge. "Stay close." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Storm's getting worse. Eleanor stumbled after him, her exhausted body moving on instinct alone. She had no choice but to trust this stranger, this mountain man who had appeared like some ancient spirit from the wilderness itself. He had saved them from the wolf, but that didn't mean they were safe. In these mountains, in winter, nothing was ever truly safe. The man moved with confidence through the blinding snow, following a path only he could see. Eleanor struggled to keep pace, her frozen feet clumsy and uncooperative. Twice she nearly fell, and each time the man paused, waiting silently for her to regain her footing before continuing onward. They crested the ridge, and suddenly, there it was. A log cabin nestled against a stone outcropping that sheltered it. From the worst of the wind, smoke rose from a stone chimney, dispersing quickly in the gusting air. It was small but solidly built, with a covered porch and what appeared to be a stable or storage shed attached to one side. The man didn't pause, striding directly to the cabin door and shouldering it open without breaking stride. Eleanor followed him inside, nearly collapsing as the wall of heat from the fireplace hit her frozen skin. The cabin's interior was dimly lit but meticulously organized. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a cooking pot suspended above the flames. A rough-hewn table and two chairs stood near the room's center, while a narrow bed occupied the far corner. Above, a small loft area was visible, presumably additional sleeping space. Various tools hung from the walls, alongside several animal pelts and what appeared to be dried herbs and plants. The man carried Grace directly to the bed, laying her down with unexpected care. "She needs warmth," he said, reaching for a pile of furs at the bed's foot, "and dry clothes." Eleanor moved to her daughter's side, her numb fingers fumbling with Grace's frozen jacket buttons. The man turned away, moving to stoke the fire higher before retrieving a kettle of water. "I have some clothes that might fit her," he said, nodding toward a trunk against the far wall. "Wife's things. Been stored a while, but they're clean and dry." The casual mention of a wife gave Eleanor pause. She glanced around the cabin again, but saw no evidence of a woman's presence. No feminine touches, no small personal items. Just the sparse, functional space of a man living alone. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for what this stranger had done, yet all she had to offer. "I don't know what would have happened if—" "You'd have died," he interrupted, his voice matter-of-fact rather than cruel. "Both of you." He set the kettle over the fire and turned to face her. "Got a name?" "Eleanor Foster. My daughter is Grace." She hesitated, then asked, "And you are?" The man seemed to consider whether to answer, his expression unreadable beneath the beard and shadow of his hat brim. Finally, he removed his hat, revealing dark hair streaked with silver at the temples. "Noah Bennett," he said. "This is my mountain." The possessive phrase struck Eleanor as odd, not my land or my property, but my mountain, as if he claimed kinship with the wilderness itself. Before she could respond, Grace stirred slightly, a small whimper escaping her blue-tinged lips. Noah moved to the fire, ladling something from the cooking pot into a wooden bowl. "She needs warmth from the inside, too," he said, bringing the bowl to Eleanor. "Broth. Not much, but it'll help." Eleanor took the bowl, feeling the blessed heat seep into her fingers. The scent that rose from it, rich and savory, made her suddenly painfully aware of her own hunger. How long had it been since they'd eaten anything substantial? A day? 2? Noah seemed to read her thoughts. "There's enough for you too," he said, already turning back to the pot. Once the girls settled, Eleanor helped Grace into a sitting position, supporting her head as she coaxed the warm broth between the child's pale lips. Grace swallowed reflexively at first, then more eagerly as awareness slowly returned to her eyes. "Mama?" she whispered, confusion clouding her features as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "We're safe, Gracie," Eleanor assured her, smoothing back the child's tangled hair. "This man, Mr. Bennett, he helped us." Grace's gaze shifted to Noah, who stood by the fire, his back to them. Her small fingers tightened around Eleanor's wrist. "Where are we?" "Mr. Bennett's cabin," Eleanor explained. "We got lost in the storm. Remember, he found us." Grace said nothing more, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Eleanor helped her into dry clothes, a simple cotton nightgown that hung past her feet, and tucked the furs around her. Within minutes, the child was asleep, her breathing deeper and more regular than it had been for hours. Only then did Eleanor allow her own exhaustion to surface, her legs nearly buckling as she rose from the bedside. Noah appeared at her elbow, steadying her with a firm grip. "Sit," he said, guiding her to one of the chairs by the table. "Before you fall." Eleanor didn't argue. Her body seemed to collapse in on itself as she sank onto the wooden chair. Noah placed a bowl of broth before her, along with a chunk of dark bread. "Eat," he instructed. "Then we'll see about dry clothes for you too." Eleanor stared at the food, suddenly overwhelmed by the simple kindness. After days of cold and hunger and fear, after Richard's callous dismissal and the brutal indifference of the storm, this stranger's matter-of-fact assistance seemed almost too much to bear. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. "Thank you," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. "You saved our lives." Noah didn't acknowledge the gratitude. He merely nodded toward the food. "Eat while it's hot," he said, turning away to hang his coat beside the door. Eleanor obeyed, lifting the spoon with trembling hands. The broth was simple. Venison, she thought, with wild onions and some herbs she couldn't identify. But in that moment, it tasted better than the finest meal she'd ever eaten in her life. As warmth slowly returned to her body, she became aware of Noah moving about the cabin with quiet efficiency, hanging their wet clothes near the fire, adding wood to the flames, checking on Grace with a glance that he probably thought Eleanor didn't notice. He was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands hardened by work and weather. His beard was shot through with grey, though she guessed he wasn't much past 35. There was a watchfulness about him, a tension in his movements, that suggested a man accustomed to solitude, uncomfortable with invasion of his space. Yet he had brought them here without hesitation, had saved them when he could have simply turned away. "The storm's getting worse," Noah said, breaking the silence as he glanced toward the single window. The glass was frosted over, but the howling of the wind had intensified, rattling the sturdy walls of the cabin. "You're lucky I found you when I did." "Why were you out in such weather?" Eleanor asked, curiosity overcoming her exhaustion. Noah's expression remained impassive. "Checking trap lines," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "Where were you headed?" "Willow Creek," Eleanor replied. "My sister lives there." Noah shook his head slightly. "You were going the wrong way. Willow Creek's east of here, not north. Storm must have turned you around." The realization that they had been walking deeper into the wilderness, away from safety, sent a chill through Eleanor that had nothing to do with her damp clothes. "How far?" she asked, dreading the answer. "From here?" Noah considered. 4 days in good weather. More than a week in this. He nodded toward the window. "And that's not breaking anytime soon." Eleanor's heart sank. A week. They had no supplies, no proper winter clothing. Grace was already weakened from exposure and hunger, and this man, this stranger, surely didn't want them imposing on his solitude for days on end. "We'll leave as soon as the storm passes," she said quickly. "I don't wish to be a burden." Noah's dark eyes met hers, assessing. "You won't make it to Willow Creek," he said bluntly. "Not till spring." "But my sister, does she know you're coming?" Eleanor hesitated, then shook her head. "No, there wasn't time to send word." "Then she's not expecting you," Noah concluded. "She'll assume you're waiting out winter wherever you were." "Oak Ridge Valley," Eleanor supplied. "We lived there until—" She trailed off, unwilling to explain the humiliation of their eviction. Noah didn't press. He merely nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "Winter set in early this year," he said. "Passes will be blocked for months. You're on Raven's Peak now. There's no leaving till the thaw." The finality in his voice left no room for argument. They were trapped here, on this mountain, in this cabin, with this inscrutable man, until winter released its grip on the Blue Ridge. Eleanor looked toward Grace, sleeping peacefully beneath the firs. Her daughter was safe for now, warm and fed. That was what mattered. Tomorrow they could worry about what came next. Noah followed her gaze, something softening almost imperceptibly in his expression. "The loft's yours," he said, nodding toward the ladder that led to the small space above. "I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't take your bed," Eleanor protested. "Not a suggestion," Noah replied, his tone making it clear the matter wasn't open for discussion. "There's clothes in the trunk. Help yourself." With that, he turned away, busying himself with some task on the far side of the cabin. The conversation, such as it was, had ended. Eleanor sat in silence, the empty bowl before her, fatigue pulling at her limbs. She was alive. Grace was alive. For tonight, that was enough. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, not least of which was understanding the taciturn mountain man who had saved them and whose domain they now shared. Outside, the storm raged on, sealing them in this unexpected sanctuary. The wind carried the eerie call of a raven through the darkness, a sound that locals claimed was an omen, though whether good or ill, Eleanor couldn't remember. Perhaps it was neither. Perhaps in these mountains, such distinctions didn't matter. What mattered was survival. And for now, at least, survival meant putting her faith in Noah Bennett, a man whose mountain had nearly killed them, and whose intervention had given them a chance at life. Eleanor woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The loft was dark, save for the faint glow of firelight seeping through the floorboards. For a terrifying moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then it all rushed back. The storm, the wolf, Noah Bennett. She sat up slowly, her body aching in places she hadn't known could hurt. The furs Noah had provided were warm, almost too warm after days of bitter cold. She peered over the edge of the loft. Grace still slept peacefully in the bed below. One small hand curled against her cheek. Eleanor's throat tightened at the sight of her daughter's face, now flushed with healthy color rather than the deathly pallor of the day before. How close they had come to perishing in that endless white wilderness. How strange that salvation had come in the form of this solitary mountain man. Speaking of whom, Eleanor scanned the cabin's main room but saw no sign of Noah. His bearskin coat was missing from its hook by the door. The fire still burned steadily in the hearth, recently fed by the look of the flames. He must have gone out, despite the continuing storm. Eleanor descended the ladder carefully, wincing as her frozen feet thawed painfully. She had changed into dry clothes the night before, a simple woolen dress that hung loose on her frame, clearly made for someone broader in the shoulders and hips. Noah's wife, she presumed, though he'd offered no explanations, and she'd asked for none. The cabin was eerily quiet without Noah's presence. The only sounds, the crackling of the fire and the occasional moan of the wind as it searched for entry through the well-sealed logs. Eleanor moved to the single window, wiping away the frost with her sleeve. The storm had abated somewhat, though snow still fell in thick, lazy flakes. The world outside was blindingly white, the trees transformed into ghostly sentinels. She could see why Noah had said there would be no traveling for months. The snow already reached halfway up the window, and drifts piled against the cabin's walls suggested it was much deeper in places. A soft noise from the bed drew her attention. Grace was stirring, her eyes fluttering open to take in the strange surroundings. Eleanor moved quickly to her daughter's side, smoothing back her tangled hair. "Good morning, sweet girl," she murmured. "How are you feeling?" Grace blinked sleepily. "Warm," she said, as if the sensation were novel. She glanced around the cabin, her expression guarded. "Where's the man?" "Mr. Bennett has gone outside for a while," Eleanor explained. "He'll be back soon, I imagine." Grace nodded solemnly, accepting this information without comment. She had always been a quiet child, observant. Beyond her years, and the hardships of recent months had only intensified this trait. She rarely complained, rarely questioned, simply adapted to whatever circumstances they found themselves in, a resilience that broke Eleanor's heart, even as it filled her with fierce pride. "Are you hungry?" Eleanor asked, eager to do something, anything that might resemble normalcy. Grace nodded again. Eleanor rose and moved to the hearth, where a pot still hung over the coals. She lifted the lid, cautiously. Inside was the same venison broth from the night before, kept warm by the fire's heat. She ladled some into a wooden bowl and brought it to Grace, who accepted it with small, careful hands. "Slowly now," Eleanor cautioned. "You don't want to make yourself sick." As Grace ate, Eleanor took stock of their surroundings more thoroughly than her exhaustion had permitted the previous night. The cabin, though small, showed evidence of thoughtful construction. The logs were precisely fitted, chinked with a mixture of clay and something fibrous, moss perhaps, that kept the bitter wind at bay. The stone fireplace was expertly built, drawing smoke efficiently upward rather than allowing it to fill the room. Shelves lined one wall, holding an assortment of tools, containers, and what appeared to be dried herbs and plants. Near the door hung several animal pelts, rabbit, fox, and something larger that Eleanor couldn't identify. Beneath them stood a wooden rack holding Noah's rifle, and a collection of knives ranging from small skinning blades to a substantial hunting knife. Everything in the space served a purpose. There were no decorative touches, no items kept merely for beauty or sentiment, except Eleanor's gaze fell on a small wooden figure sitting on the mantel above the fireplace. Curious, she moved closer. It was a bird, intricately carved from dark wood, its wings folded close to its body, head slightly cocked as if listening. A raven, she realized, recognizing the distinctive shape of the beak. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every feather delineated with painstaking detail. Did he make that? Grace's question startled Eleanor. She hadn't heard her daughter slip from the bed to stand beside her, empty bowl in hand. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "It seems likely he appears to live alone." Grace studied the carving, her expression thoughtful. "It looks like it's listening to something," she observed. "Yes, it does." Eleanor resisted the urge to touch the carving, sensing it might be one of the few personal items in Noah's otherwise utilitarian space. The cabin door swung open suddenly, bringing with it a gust of frigid air and a swirl of snowflakes. Noah stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots before carefully closing the door behind him. He carried an armload of split wood, which he deposited in the box beside the hearth without acknowledgement of their presence. Only after he had removed his coat and hung it on its peg did he turn to regard them, his dark eyes moving from Eleanor to Grace and back again. "You're up," he said simply. Eleanor nodded, feeling strangely caught out, as if they had been intruding merely by examining their surroundings. "Yes, thank you for the broth." Grace was hungry. Noah's gaze settled on the child, who regarded him with solemn curiosity. Something almost imperceptible shifted in his expression. Not a softening exactly, but a slight easing of the guard he seemed to maintain. "Good," he said. "She needs to eat, build back her strength." He moved to the fire, adding another log, with practiced ease. "Storm's letting up some. Not enough to travel, but I could check the trap lines." His eyes flicked to Eleanor. "Might be rabbit for dinner, if we're lucky." The domesticity of the statement struck Eleanor as oddly incongruous, coming from this taciturn, solitary man. As if sensing her thought, Noah straightened, his expression closing again. "There's more broth if you're hungry," he said, already moving toward the door, reaching for his coat. "And tea in the tin on the shelf. Help yourself." Before Eleanor could respond, he was gone, the door closing firmly behind him. She stood for a moment, bemused by the abruptness of his departure. It seemed Noah Bennett was a man unaccustomed to company, perhaps even uncomfortable with it. "He doesn't talk much," Grace observed, returning to the bed and wrapping herself in the furs. "No," Eleanor agreed. "I suppose when you live alone on a mountain, there's not much need for conversation." She busied herself preparing tea, finding the tin exactly where Noah had indicated. The familiar task brought a measure of comfort, a small piece of ordinary life in these extraordinary circumstances. As the water heated, she remembered her promise to herself, to consider their next steps in the harsh light of day. But what steps could there be? Noah had been unequivocal. There would be no leaving Raven's Peak until spring. They were stranded here, dependent on the grudging hospitality of a man they'd known less than a day. A man who, for all his unquestioning aid, clearly preferred his solitude to their company. They had no supplies of their own, no means of surviving. The brutal mountain winter without Noah's assistance. The realization settled cold and heavy in Eleanor's stomach. After all her desperate efforts to maintain her independence following Matthew's death, after the humiliation of Richard's dismissal, here she was, utterly dependent once more. She poured the hot water over the tea leaves, watching them unfurl. In the steaming liquid, what choice did they have? None, she acknowledged grimly. For now, at least, their survival depended entirely on Noah Bennett's continued goodwill. Grace's voice interrupted her troubled thoughts. "Mama, look, there's a dog." Eleanor turned to see her daughter pointing toward the window. Moving to Grace's side, she peered through the glass. Sure enough, a large dog was making its way through the snow toward the cabin, a rangy, wolf-like creature with a thick gray coat. It moved with purpose, following what appeared to be Noah's tracks through the deep snow. "I think it's Mr. Bennett's hunting dog," Eleanor said, watching as the animal paused to sniff the air before continuing toward the cabin. "Will it come inside?" Grace asked, a note of eagerness in her voice. She had always loved animals, a trait that had served her well during their time on Matthew's small farm. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "Perhaps it stays in the stable." As if in answer, they heard a scratching at the door. Grace slipped from the bed, clearly intending to let the animal in, but Eleanor caught her arm. "Wait," she cautioned. "We don't know if Mr. Bennet allows it inside, and it might not be friendly to strangers." Grace's face fell, but she nodded obediently. The scratching came again, more insistent this time, accompanied by a low whine. Eleanor hesitated. The dog clearly expected entry, suggesting it was indeed accustomed to being inside the cabin. And if it was unfriendly, surely Noah wouldn't have left them alone with it nearby. Decision made, she moved to the door and opened it cautiously. The dog regarded her with intelligent amber eyes, making no move to enter. It was larger than she'd thought, lean but powerful, with a scarred muzzle that spoke of past fights. Not a pet then, but a working animal, likely as independent as its master. "Hello," Eleanor said softly, extending her hand for the dog to sniff. "Are you coming in?" The dog considered her for a moment, then padded past her into the cabin, shaking snow from its thick coat. It surveyed the room before settling itself before the fire with a heavy sigh, as if the weight of the world rested on its shoulders. Grace approached slowly, her eyes alight with interest. "Can I pet it, Mama?" "Carefully," Eleanor cautioned. "Let it get used to you first." Grace knelt a few feet from the dog, allowing it to see her clearly. "Hello," she said softly. "I'm Grace." The dog lifted its head, regarding her with that same intelligent gaze it had directed at Eleanor. Then, to Eleanor's surprise, it rose and moved toward Grace, circling her once before lying down again, this time with its head resting against her knee. Grace looked up at Eleanor, delight spreading across her face. "It likes me." "So it seems," Eleanor agreed, amazed at the animal's acceptance of her daughter. "But be gentle. It's not a pet like the farm dogs." "I know," Grace said solemnly, her small hand moving carefully over the dog's broad head. "It's a working dog, like Mr. Bennet is a working man." The observation, so simple yet so perceptive, caught Eleanor off guard. Yes, Noah Bennet was indeed a working man. Every aspect of his existence seemed dedicated to the practical business of survival in this harsh environment. There was a purity to it, a clarity of purpose that she found herself unexpectedly admiring. The door opened again, bringing Eleanor's thoughts to an abrupt halt. Noah stepped inside, a string of rabbits slung over his shoulder. His gaze immediately found the dog, now contentedly receiving Grace's attentions. "I see you've met Timber," he said, his expression unreadable. "The dog scratched at the door," Eleanor explained quickly. "I thought perhaps he was accustomed to coming inside. I hope that's all right." Noah hung the rabbits on a hook near the door before removing his coat. "He goes where he pleases," he said with a slight shrug. "Been with me 5 years. Knows his own mind." Grace looked up from her ministrations to the dog. "He's very nice," she offered. "He let me pet him right away." Noah regarded her thoughtfully. "Did he now? He doesn't usually take to strangers." "Grace has always had a way with animals," Eleanor said, feeling an inexplicable need to explain. Even the most ill-tempered barn cat would let her hold it. Noah merely nodded, moving to the hearth to warm his hands. The dog, Timber, raised his head in acknowledgement of his master's return, but made no move to leave Grace's side. Noah noticed this, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "He's chosen his company for the day, it seems," he observed, and Eleanor thought. She detected the faintest trace of amusement in his tone. It vanished quickly, replaced by his usual impassivity as he gestured toward the rabbits. "Need to dress those before they freeze solid. You know how to prepare game?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. "Yes," she said. "Matthew, my husband, he hunted. I learned to dress what he brought home." Noah nodded, apparently satisfied. "Good. You can help then. No point in sitting idle while there's work to be done." The bluntness of the statement might have offended Eleanor under different circumstances. After all, they weren't guests by choice, and she owed this man no labor. But the practicality of his approach made sense in this environment. If they were to survive the winter here, they must contribute what they could to the running of the household. And in truth, she welcomed the opportunity to be useful rather than merely dependent. "Of course," she agreed. "I'd be happy to help." Noah retrieved the rabbits and led Eleanor to a small table near the cabin's rear wall, where a collection of knives and other tools were arranged with meticulous care. He selected 2 skinning knives, handing one to Eleanor with a critical assessment of her grip. "You've done this before," he observed, as she tested the blade's edge with practiced care. "Many times," Eleanor confirmed, "though I'll admit it's been a while. After Matthew fell ill, we couldn't afford to keep his hunting rifle." She hadn't meant to reveal that piece of their history, and yet it had slipped out, unbidden. Noah said nothing, simply nodding as he began work on the first rabbit with efficient, practiced movements. Eleanor focused on her own task, grateful for the silence. She had no desire to explain the gradual erosion of their lives following Matthew's injury, how they had sold possession after possession, keeping only what was absolutely necessary, until finally there had been nothing left to sell except the land itself, and that, according to Richard, had never truly been theirs to begin with. They worked in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional instruction from Noah or question from Eleanor about his preferred method of preservation. He was, she discovered, a patient teacher when it came to practical matters, explaining the specific techniques he used to maximize the meat gained from each animal and preserve what couldn't be eaten immediately. "Winter's long," he said, as they finished the last rabbit. "Nothing goes to waste." Eleanor nodded, understanding implicitly. In this environment, wastefulness wasn't merely extravagant, it was potentially fatal. Every resource had to be carefully managed to ensure survival until spring. She thought of Richard and Harriet, with their well-stocked root cellar and smokehouse, turning her and Grace away to face winter alone. The contrast between their callous dismissal and Noah's matter-of-fact assistance couldn't be more stark. "Thank you," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could consider them, "for taking us in, for all of this." She gestured vaguely around the cabin. Noah looked up from his work, his expression guarded. "Couldn't very well leave. You out there," he said, as if the notion were absurd. "No one survives a night in that kind of storm." "Many would have simply ridden past," Eleanor countered, "especially seeing a stranger on their land." "Not their land," Noah corrected, a sudden edge to his voice. "The mountain doesn't belong to anyone. We're just passing through, all of us." The philosophy surprised Eleanor. It seemed incongruous coming from a man who had claimed, "This is my mountain," upon their first meeting. She studied him with new interest, wondering at the apparent contradiction. "Nevertheless," she persisted, "you saved our lives. I won't forget that." Noah's discomfort with her gratitude was palpable. He rose abruptly, gathering the dressed rabbits. "Need to get these hanging," he said, already moving toward the door. "Stew pots on the fire if you're hungry." And like that, he was gone again. The conversation terminated as decisively as if he'd slammed a door between them. Eleanor stared after him, perplexed by his reaction. It was as if her gratitude was somehow more intrusive than her physical presence in his home. Grace had watched the exchange from her place by the fire, Timber still lounging contentedly beside her. Now she spoke, her voice thoughtful. "He doesn't like being thanked." Eleanor smiled at her daughter's perception. "So it seems." "Why not?" Eleanor considered the question. thinking of the mysterious Noah Bennett with his self-sufficient existence and his reluctance to accept even verbal acknowledgement of his aid. "I think," she said slowly, "that Mr. Bennett believes helping others in need is simply what one does, not something worthy of special gratitude. Like when Papa would help Mr. Finch with his hay, even though his leg hurt him," Grace suggested. "He said that's just what neighbors do." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, her throat tightening at the memory of Matthew's unfailing generosity, even as his injury slowly crippled him. "Very much like that." She moved to the hearth, checking the stew that simmered gently in the iron pot. The rich aroma of venison and wild onions filled the cabin, reminding her again of how close they had come to starvation. How very fortunate they had been that Noah Bennett had found them when he did. The door opened once more, admitting Noah along with a blast of cold air. This time, however, he didn't immediately depart again. Instead, he moved to the hearth, warming his hands over the flames. Timber rose to greet him, receiving a brief but affectionate scratch behind the ears before returning to Grace's side. "Storms picking up again?" Noah said, his gaze on the fire rather than on Eleanor. "Likely to be a bad one, from the look of the clouds." Eleanor nodded, unsure if he expected a response. His mood seemed as unpredictable as the mountain weather. Moments of almost companionable interaction, followed by abrupt withdrawals. She wondered how long it had been since he'd shared his space with another person. Years, perhaps, given his apparent discomfort with basic social exchanges. "Will your traplines be safe?" she asked, grasping for neutral conversation. Noah shrugged. "Most are sheltered enough. Might lose a few, but I know where to find them again once the snow settles." He glanced toward the window, where darkness was already gathering, though it couldn't be past mid-afternoon. "Won't be checking them tomorrow in any case. Not in what's coming." A day confined to the cabin, then. Eleanor suppressed a flicker of unease at the prospect of such close quarters with this unpredictable stranger. She reminded herself firmly that Noah had given them no reason to fear him. Quite the opposite. He had saved their lives, fed them, clothed them, and asked for nothing in return, save help with tasks she would have volunteered for regardless. "I noticed you have quite a collection of herbs," she said, nodding toward the shelves where bundles of dried plants hung. "Are they medicinal?" Noah followed her gaze, something like surprise flickering across his features at her interest. "Some," he acknowledged, "good for fevers, stomach ailments, wounds that won't heal right." "You're a healer, then?" Noah's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "No, just a man who lives far from doctors, had to learn which plants help and which harm. My grandmother was skilled with herbs," Eleanor offered. "She taught me some, though I've forgotten much over the years." Noah studied her with renewed interest. "That kind of knowledge is valuable," he said. "Too many dismiss it as old wives' tales." "Matthew's doctor certainly did," Eleanor agreed, remembering the physician's dismissive reaction when she'd suggested a poultice for Matthew's increasingly infected wound. He preferred his mercury treatments, though they seemed to cause as much suffering as the injury itself. She regretted the words as soon as they left her mouth. She had no wish to discuss Matthew's slow, painful decline, nor the impotent rage. She had felt watching treatments that seemed to hasten rather than halt his deterioration. Yet something in Noah's attentive silence encouraged confidence. He didn't offer platitudes or change the subject, as others invariably did when illness was mentioned. "The wound never healed properly," she continued, surprising herself. "It festered for months. The pain—" She swallowed hard. The pain was unbearable toward the end. Noah's expression remained impassive, but his eyes held something like recognition. "Some wounds don't heal," he said quietly. "Not with all the herbs in the forest." The simple statement contained such weight, such implicit understanding of suffering that Eleanor found herself momentarily speechless. She sensed they were no longer discussing Matthew's physical injury, but something deeper, something Noah himself carried. "No," she agreed softly. "Some don't." The moment stretched between them, a fragile connection formed through shared understanding of pain. Then Noah straightened, the vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "Stew's ready," he said, reaching for bowls from a nearby shelf. "Best eat while it's hot." And just like that, the moment passed, leaving Eleanor with more questions than answers about the enigmatic mountain man whose roof now sheltered them. She accepted the bowl he offered, noting the care with which he apportioned the stew, ensuring Grace received the most tender portions, a consideration that stood in stark contrast to his gruff demeanor. They ate in silence, the only sounds the howl of the strengthening wind and the occasional contented sigh from Timber as Grace surreptitiously slipped him morsels of meat. Outside, the early winter darkness had fallen completely, transforming the window into a black mirror that reflected their small circle of firelight. Eleanor caught Noah watching Grace as she fed the dog, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. When he noticed her observation, he returned his attention to his meal, but not before Eleanor glimpsed something in his gaze. A fleeting emotion she couldn't quite identify. Pain? Longing? Whatever it was, it vanished beneath his customary stoicism, leaving her to wonder if she had imagined it entirely. As they finished their meal, the wind rose to a shriek, rattling the sturdy cabin with its force. Grace pressed closer to Eleanor's side, her eyes wide. "It sounds angry," she whispered. Noah rose to add wood to the fire, his movements deliberate, in the face of the storm's fury. "Not angry," he said, addressing Grace directly for perhaps the first time, "just powerful. The wind doesn't feel one way or another about us. It simply is." Grace considered this with furrowed brow. "Like God?" she asked finally. The question clearly caught Noah off guard. He stared at the child for a long moment before responding, choosing his words with unusual care. "Some might say so," he allowed. "Though I've found the mountain more reliable than prayers." Eleanor tensed, anticipating a harsh rebuke of faith that would upset Grace, who had been raised with Matthew's simple but sincere belief. To her surprise, Noah added, "Still, I suppose there's room for both. The mountain and whatever might have made it." The measured response revealed yet another unexpected facet of Noah Bennett, a philosophical depth at odds with his solitary, pragmatic existence. Eleanor found herself revising her initial assessment of him with each passing hour. Who was this man who lived alone on a mountain, who carved ravens with exquisite care, who knew medicinal herbs and spoke of mountains with reverence, who alternated between brusque efficiency and moments of surprising insight? Before she could ponder further, a particularly vicious gust battered the cabin, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Grace flinched against Eleanor's side. "Will the house blow away?" she asked, her voice small. Noah shook his head with absolute certainty. "No. This cabin stood through 30 winters. Built it to last." "You built it yourself?" Eleanor asked. Impressed. "Mostly had help with the heavy lifting at first." A shadow crossed his face. "A long time ago." There it was again, that hint of old pain, quickly suppressed. Eleanor wanted to ask who had helped him, what had happened to separate Noah from whoever had shared his life before. But his closed expression warned against such inquiries. Some doors remained firmly shut. Instead, she focused on reassuring Grace. "We're perfectly safe here," she said, smoothing her daughter's hair. "The storm can't harm us." "Your mother's right," Noah confirmed, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Best thing to do in a storm like this is stay warm and get rest. Morning will come soon enough, and with it, work that needs doing. It was as clear a suggestion for retirement as politeness allowed. Eleanor nodded, understanding his desire for privacy after a day of unexpected companionship. "Come, Grace," she said, rising from her seat by the fire. "Time for bed." Grace reluctantly disengaged herself from Timber, who watched her with apparent disappointment as she moved toward the bed in the corner. "Can Timber sleep with me?" she asked, looking from Eleanor to Noah with hopeful eyes. Eleanor deferred to Noah with a glance. It was his dog, after all, and his cabin. The question seemed to catch him off balance, as if the normal rules of his existence were being rearranged before his eyes. "He usually sleeps where he chooses," Noah said finally. "If he wants to stay with you, that's his decision." Grace beamed. At this response, clearly interpreting it as permission, she patted the edge of the bed invitingly. "Come on, Timber, you can sleep here." To Eleanor's surprise, and judging by his expression to Noah's as well, the dog rose immediately and he padded to the bed, hopping up with practiced ease and settling himself alongside the spot where Grace would sleep. The child's delighted smile was the first truly unguarded expression of joy Eleanor had seen on her face since Matthew's death. "Thank you, Mr. Bennet," Grace said solemnly. "And thank you, Timber." Noah seemed at a loss for response, merely nodding his acknowledgement before turning back to the fire. Eleanor helped Grace prepare for bed, tucking the furs around her and Timber with an amused shake of her head at the unlikely pair. Within minutes, Grace was asleep, one small arm flung over the dog's broad back. Eleanor retreated to the ladder leading to the loft, pausing before ascending. "Good night, Mr. Bennet," she said softly, "and thank you again for your hospitality." Noah remained by the fire, his back to her, shoulders rigid with some tension she couldn't name. For a moment she thought he wouldn't respond. Then, without turning, he spoke, his voice low but clear. "Noah," he said, "if we're to share a roof till spring, might as well use my given name." The simple concession, offered stiffly but sincerely, felt significant. A small bridge extended across the gulf of their different worlds. "Noah, then," Eleanor agreed, "and I'm Eleanor." He nodded once, still facing the fire. "Good night, Eleanor." As she climbed to the loft, Eleanor felt the weight of the day settling into her bones, the lingering cold, the physical labor of dressing game, the emotional toll of their precarious situation. Yet beneath the exhaustion lay something unexpected, not comfort exactly, nor security, but perhaps the beginning of both. Outside, the storm raged on, wrapping the cabin in a cocoon of wind and snow. Inside, the fire burned steadily, holding the darkness at bay. And somewhere in the vast distance between safety and peril, three unlikely companions began the long process of finding their way through a mountain winter, and perhaps through the wilderness of their own guarded hearts. Days passed in a rhythm as steady and unchanging as the mountain itself. The terrible storm raged for 3 days, trapping them within the cabin's walls, forcing a proximity that none of them had anticipated or particularly desired. Noah continued his pattern of abrupt departures whenever conversation threatened to move beyond the practical matters of survival, vanishing to the small workshop attached to the cabin's rear, or braving the storm to check his nearest traplines. Eleanor found herself settling into the routine of this strange, suspended existence with surprising ease. There was comfort in the simplicity of their days, tending the fire, preparing meals, mending clothes that Noah produced from a trunk that surely held the last vestiges of his former life. She did not ask about the woman who had worn these garments. Before, sensing that such questions would only drive Noah further into his self-imposed isolation. Grace, with the remarkable adaptability of childhood, had established her own place in their unlikely household. She had appointed herself Timber's caretaker, a role the dog accepted with dignified tolerance. More surprising was Noah's tacit approval of this arrangement. Though he rarely addressed Grace directly, Eleanor caught him watching the pair with an expression that, while not quite soft, lacked its usual guardedness. On the fourth day, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a transformed landscape. The snow lay deep and pristine around the cabin, drifts piled against the walls reaching nearly to the windowsill. The morning sun cast a golden glow across the untouched white, so brilliant it hurt the eyes to look at it directly. Eleanor stood at the window, gazing out at the blinding expanse. The beauty of it caught in her throat. This wild, dangerous place that had nearly claimed their lives now revealed itself as something close to divine. The forest that surrounded Noah's clearing wore a mantle of snow and ice that transformed, each pine into a crystal sculpture, each branch a delicate work of art. "Pretty, isn't it?" The question startled her. Noah stood just behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cabin's cool morning air. She hadn't heard him approach. Another reminder of how completely this man belonged to the wilderness, moving through it with the silent confidence of a predator. "Beautiful," she agreed, not turning. "And deadly." Noah made a sound that might have been a chuckle, like most beautiful things. The observation surprised her. It seemed unlike Noah to speak in metaphors, to acknowledge beauty at all. She glanced at him, but his expression revealed nothing beyond his usual reserve. "The passes will be completely blocked now," he said, his tone returning to its practical register. "No chance of travel until the spring thaw." Eleanor nodded, accepting the reality of their situation anew. "How long?" she asked. "Until spring?" Noah considered, his dark eyes scanning the landscape as if reading signs invisible to her. "Late March, if we're lucky. More likely April, depends on how the winter goes. 4 months, perhaps more." The knowledge settled over Eleanor like a physical weight. 4 months of dependency on this stranger's charity. 4 months of close quarters with a man who guarded his privacy as fiercely as any treasure. "We'll find ways to contribute," she said, more to herself than to Noah. "We won't be a burden." Noah's gaze shifted to her, his expression unreadable. "Never said you were." "You didn't have to," Eleanor replied. "It's plain enough. No one chooses to suddenly have 2 extra mouths to feed through a mountain winter." For a long moment, Noah said nothing. Then, with a slight nod toward the door, he said, "Come with me, need to show you something." Curious, Eleanor followed him outside, pausing only to wrap herself in the heavy woolen shawl she'd found among the clothes Noah had provided. The cold hit her with physical force as she stepped onto the porch, the air so crisp it seemed to crystallize in her lungs. Noah moved through the deep snow with practiced ease, breaking a path for her to follow. He led her around the cabin to the small outbuilding she had noticed on their arrival. She had assumed it was a stable or storage shed, but as Noah pushed open the door, she realized it was a workshop of sorts. The space was meticulously organized, with tools hanging on one wall and various projects in different stages of completion. Scattered around the room, a small stove in the corner provided minimal heat, enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay. But what caught Eleanor's attention were the carvings. Dozens of wooden birds, ravens mostly, but also smaller songbirds, hawks, even an owl, lined shelves along the walls. Each was exquisitely detailed, captured in different poses of flight or rest. Some were simple, almost abstract, while others were so lifelike she half expected them to take wing at her approach. "You made all of these?" she asked, moving closer to examine a particularly striking raven, its wings half spread as if about to launch itself skyward. Noah nodded, watching her reaction closely. "Winter's long," he said, echoing his earlier statement about preserving meat. "Hands need something to do when the days grow short." Eleanor reached out, running her fingers over the smooth wood of the raven's wing. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, revealing a sensitivity and attention to detail she wouldn't have expected from Noah's calloused hands and taciturn manner. "They're beautiful," she said simply, meaning it. Noah accepted the compliment with a slight inclination of his head. Then he moved to a workbench at the rear of the room, drawing her attention to several larger carvings draped in cloth. "People. Down in the valley by them," he said, pulling aside the covering to reveal an intricate panel depicting a mountain landscape, complete with trees, a flowing river, and soaring birds overhead. "Trading post takes them in spring, brings supplies in return." Eleanor studied the panel with growing understanding. "This is how you support yourself," she realized aloud. "Your carvings." "Partly," Noah confirmed. "Furs, too. Some meat. But, yes, these bring the best return." He gestured to another covered shape, was working on this when the storm hit. He pulled back the cloth to reveal a rocking chair, the frame complete but the seat and back not yet finished. The armrests were carved with a pattern of intertwining vines and leaves, so delicate they seemed to grow from the wood itself. "Commission," Noah explained, "for the preacher's wife down in Oak Ridge. Been working on it since fall." "Oak Ridge," Eleanor repeated, surprise coloring her voice. "Oak Ridge Valley." Noah nodded, his expression questioning. "That's where we came from," Eleanor said before. She trailed off, unwilling to revisit the memory of their eviction. "Small world," Noah observed, though he didn't press for details. Instead, he turned back to the panel he'd shown her first. "Point is, I've been preparing for winter since spring, and did always do. Extra supplies, extra wood, extra everything." He looked at her directly, his gaze steady. "Two more mouths don't change much in that equation." The reassurance, delivered in Noah's characteristic blunt manner, eased something in Eleanor's chest. They weren't taking food from his mouth, at least. That was something. "Still," she insisted, "we'll work for our keep. I can cook, clean, mend, help with whatever needs doing." Noah studied her for a moment, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he nodded toward a pile of wood in the corner. "Know anything about carving?" Eleanor shook her head. "Nothing beyond whittling sticks for Grace to play with." "Could teach you," Noah offered, the words coming slowly, as if he were surprising himself with them. "Simple things to start. Might be a way to pass the time." The offer stunned Eleanor. It wasn't merely the suggestion of teaching her a skill. It was the implicit acknowledgement that he anticipated hours of shared company, that he was making space for her in this private sanctuary where he created beauty from raw wood. "I'd like that," she said finally, aware that her response mattered more than it should. "Very much." Noah nodded once, decisively, as if settling a matter with himself. "Good. We'll start tomorrow. Meantime, need to check the far trap lines." He glanced at the sky through the workshop's single small window. "Should be back by midday." As they returned to the cabin, Eleanor found herself revising her understanding of Noah Bennett yet again. The solitary mountain man, the rescuer who accepted no thanks, the taciturn host who fled from personal conversation. All these aspects of him remained true. But now she had glimpsed something else. An artist whose hands created works of surprising beauty. A man who had considered their needs in his household calculations, who had offered to share his private craft with her. The contradiction fascinated her like a puzzle box whose sides shifted each time she thought she understood its mechanism. Who was Noah Bennett, truly? And why did she find herself increasingly drawn to discovering the answer? Grace was awake when they returned, sitting by the fire with Timber stretched out beside her. The dog raised his head at their entrance, acknowledging Noah with a lazy thump of his tail, before settling back into his comfortable position. "Traitor," Noah muttered, though there was no heat in the word. choosing a warm bed over honest work. "Is he supposed to help with the traps?" Grace asked, her hand resting protectively on Timber's broad head. "Used to," Noah said, reaching for his heavy coat. "Before he got spoiled." Grace looked momentarily distressed, but Noah added, "He's earned his rest. Saved my life more than once." "Really?" Grace's eyes widened with interest. "How?" Noah hesitated, clearly unaccustomed to a child's direct questions. Eleanor expected him to dismiss the inquiry with his usual brusqueness, but after a moment he said, "Mountain lion 3 winters back. Got between me and it when I was checking traps without my rifle. Foolish mistake." He touched his side briefly, and Eleanor wondered if a scar lay beneath the gesture. "Timber held it off long enough for me to get to safety." Grace looked at the dog with newfound respect. "He's very brave." "Brave and smart," Noah agreed. "Best companion a man could ask for in these mountains." With that, he nodded to Eleanor and departed, leaving her to ponder this latest revelation. Noah Bennett might be a man of few words, but when he chose to speak, his words carried weight. The day passed quietly, with Eleanor and Grace settling into what was becoming their routine. Eleanor heated water for washing clothes, their own few garments, and some of Noah's that needed attention. Grace helped as she could, though she spent much of the morning by the window, watching for Noah's return with a concern that touched Eleanor deeply. Her daughter had always been quick to form attachments, a trait that had wounded her deeply when they were forced from the only home she'd known. "Will Mr. Noah be all right out there?" Grace asked, her breath fogging the cold glass as she peered into the snowy landscape. "Mr. Bennett," Eleanor corrected gently, though Noah had made no objection to Grace's use of his given name. "And yes, he'll be fine. He knows these mountains better than anyone." "Better than the wolves," Grace persisted. Eleanor smiled, setting aside the shirt she was mending. "Even better than the wolves, I imagine. He's lived here a long time." Grace considered this, her small face solemn. "Why does he live all alone? Doesn't he get lonely?" The question struck at the heart of the mystery that was Noah Bennett. Eleanor approached the window, standing beside her daughter as they both gazed out at the pristine wilderness. "I think," she said carefully, "that sometimes people find it easier to be alone than to risk being hurt by others." "Because of his wife?" Grace asked, displaying that uncanny perceptiveness that sometimes made Eleanor wonder if her daughter could read minds. "His wife?" Eleanor repeated, startled. Grace nodded. "The lady whose clothes you're wearing. The one who used to live here, but doesn't anymore." Eleanor smoothed the wool of her borrowed dress, a strange feeling settling in her stomach. "We don't know that for certain, Gracie." "Yes, we do," Grace insisted. "There's a lady's hairbrush in the trunk, and ladies' shoes, and a picture in a little frame that Mr. Noah doesn't know I saw when I was looking for more blankets." "Grace Foster," Eleanor said sternly, "you shouldn't be prying into Mr. Bennett's personal belongings." Grace had the good grace to look slightly abashed, though not entirely repentant. "I wasn't prying on purpose. I just found things, and the picture was a lady with a baby." She looked up at Eleanor with earnest eyes. "I think that's why he helped us, because we reminded him of them." The insight, so simple yet so plausible, sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. She thought of Noah's reaction when he'd first seen them in the snow, the way his gaze had lingered on Grace, the immediate offer of shelter. The trunk of women's clothing kept all these years, the singular wooden raven on the mantel, when dozens more were stored in his workshop. "Perhaps," she allowed, unwilling to speculate further aloud. "But that's Mr. Bennett's private business, Gracie. We must respect his privacy while we're guests in his home." Grace nodded solemnly, accepting the gentle rebuke. "I just thought it might be why he's sad sometimes," she said, returning her gaze to the window. "When he thinks no one's looking." Before Eleanor could formulate a response to this observation, Timber suddenly raised his head, ears pricked forward. A moment later, he leapt from his place by the fire and trotted to the door, tail swaying gently. "He's back!" Grace exclaimed, her concern immediately transformed into delight. Sure enough, moments later the door swung open to admit Noah, his coat and hat crusted with snow, cheeks ruddy from the cold. Timber greeted him with a soft whine, circling him once before returning to his place by the fire. "Lazy beast," Noah muttered, though he reached down to ruffle the dog's ears as he passed. "Forgotten how to earn your keep entirely." "Did you find anything in your traps?" Grace asked eagerly, abandoning her post by the window to follow Noah, as he removed his outer garments. Noah glanced at her, something like surprise flickering across his features at being addressed so directly. "2 rabbits," he replied, reaching into his game bag to show her, "and signs of fox. Might catch one tomorrow if we're lucky." "What do you do with foxes?" Grace asked, studying the rabbits with interest rather than revulsion. Growing up on a farm had given her a practical understanding of where meat came from. "Fur makes good trim for coats and gloves," Noah explained, hanging the rabbits on the hook by the door. "Meat's not much good, but Timber doesn't mind it." At the sound of his name, the dog lifted his head, ears perked hopefully. "Not today, old friend," Noah said, and Eleanor was struck again by the gentle way he addressed the animal, so at odds with his taciturn manner toward humans. "These are for the pot." He moved to the hearth, extending his hands toward the flames. Eleanor noticed he favored his right side slightly, a barely perceptible stiffness in his movements that hadn't been present that morning. "Are you hurt?" she asked, concern overriding her usual hesitation to pry into his affairs. Noah glanced at her, his expression closing. "It's nothing. Old injury acts up in the cold." Eleanor recognized the deflection, but chose not to pursue it. Instead, she returned to her mending, though she kept a surreptitious eye on Noah as he moved about the cabin, preparing the rabbits for cooking. The stiffness didn't abate. If anything, it seemed to worsen as the afternoon progressed. By evening, as they sat around the fire after their meal, Noah's discomfort was evident in the tight set of his jaw and the careful way he shifted in his chair. Eleanor had seen that expression too many times on Matthew's face not to recognize pain being stoically endured. "I noticed some willow bark among your medicinal herbs," she said casually, rising to examine the dried plants hanging from the rafters. "My grandmother used to make a tea for pain, said it was particularly good for old injuries." Noah regarded her with narrowed eyes, clearly aware of her intent, but unwilling to acknowledge his own weakness. "Willow bark's bitter," he said dismissively. "Prefer my coffee straight." "Strange," Eleanor mused, selecting the bark in question. "My husband said the same thing, preferred to suffer rather than drink something unpleasant." She met Noah's gaze directly. "I always thought it an odd choice." For a moment, she thought he would refuse outright. Then, unexpectedly, a corner of his mouth quirked upward in what might almost have been amusement. "Your husband sounds like a stubborn man," he observed. "He was," Eleanor agreed, already moving to heat water for the tea. "Fortunately, I'm equally stubborn." Grace, who had been quietly arranging small wooden figures Noah had evidently carved for her at some point, looked up with interest. "Papa always said Mama would outlast a mountain if she set her mind to it," she offered. Noah's almost smile deepened slightly. "I can believe that," he said, his gaze still on Eleanor as she prepared the medicinal tea. When she handed him the steaming cup, he accepted it without further protest, though his expression as he sipped the bitter concoction suggested he shared Matthew's opinion of the remedy. "The mountain lion?" Eleanor asked quietly, nodding toward his side where she suspected the old injury lay. Noah hesitated, then nodded once. "Caught me here," he said, placing his hand against his ribs. "Deeper than it should have been. Healed. Slow." "You treated it yourself?" Eleanor asked, imagining the difficulty of tending such a wound alone in this isolated cabin. "Had no choice," Noah replied simply. "Timber kept the cat away long enough for me to get back here. After that, it was just a matter of stopping the bleeding and keeping fever at bay." Eleanor shook her head, impressed despite herself by the sheer force of will such self-treatment would require. "You're fortunate to have survived." "Timber's the reason I did," Noah said, glancing at the dog, who had raised his head at the repeated mention of his name. "Wouldn't be here otherwise." The admission, one of the few personal details Noah had volunteered, hung in the air between them. Eleanor sensed there was more to the story, but she didn't press. Noah would share what he chose to share in his own time. That he had revealed this much felt like a tentative step across the distance he so carefully maintained. The evening deepened around them, the fire casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Grace eventually succumbed to sleep, curled beneath, the furs with Timber keeping faithful watch beside her. Eleanor gathered her mending, intending to take it up to the loft, where a small lamp provided enough light to work by. "Eleanor," Noah said suddenly, his voice low to avoid disturbing Grace, "there's something you should know." The seriousness of his tone arrested her movement. She sat back down, setting aside her sewing. "What is it?" Noah stared into the fire, his profile etched in sharp relief against the dancing flames. "I go down to Oak Ridge once a month," he said, "for supplies I can't get from hunting or trapping, to arrange sales of my carvings." Eleanor nodded, waiting for him to continue, sensing this was leading somewhere significant. "Next trip is due in 3 days," Noah went on, "weather permitting." "But you said the passes were blocked," Eleanor said, confused, "that there was no way down until spring." "Main passes, yes," Noah agreed. "But there's a route I know. Difficult, not for the inexperienced, but passable if you know where to tread." Understanding dawned slowly. "You're offering to send word to my sister," she realized, "to let her know we're safe." Noah nodded, still not meeting her gaze. "Could carry a letter. Let her know you're wintering here. We'll come in spring." The offer touched Eleanor deeply. She knew what Noah wasn't saying, that such a journey was dangerous, even for someone of his experience, that he was proposing to take on additional risk solely for her peace of mind. "Thank you," she said simply. "I would be grateful for that." Noah acknowledged her thanks with a slight nod, apparently more comfortable accepting gratitude for future actions than for those already performed. "We'll leave at first light if the weather holds. Should be back by nightfall the same day." A thought occurred to Eleanor, one that sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "Will you?" She hesitated, uncertain how to phrase her concern. "Will you tell anyone else about us being here?" Noah looked at her then, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Not if you don't want me to," he said carefully. "But folks might ask questions if they spot me carrying a letter to Willow Creek. It's just..." Eleanor struggled to articulate her fear without revealing more than she wished. "My brother-in-law, Richard, he might interfere if he knew where we were." Noah's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Interfere how?" he asked, his voice deceptively mild. Eleanor looked away, ashamed of the tangled circumstances that had led them to Noah's door. "He believes the farm rightfully belongs to him now that Matthew is gone," she said finally. "He was insistent that we leave." "He turned you out," Noah said flatly, "in winter with a child." The blunt assessment made Eleanor flinch, but she couldn't deny its accuracy. "Yes. And you're concerned he might try to assert some claim over you," Noah continued, his voice still unnaturally calm. "Even here, Not over me, Eleanor clarified, but perhaps over Grace. She's a Foster by blood. Richard might claim. She trailed off, the possibility too painful to voice aloud. I see, Noah said, and something in his tone suggested he truly did. Then no one will know you're here. Not until you wish it. The promise, delivered with quiet certainty, eased Eleanor's fear more than she would have expected. There was something immovable about Noah Bennett, a solidity that suggested he would not easily be swayed once his mind was set. If he said no one would know of their presence, then no one would. Thank you, she said again, the words inadequate for the relief she felt. Noah rose, setting aside the now empty cup of willow bark tea. Should rest, he said, nodding toward his side. Journey to Oak Ridge is long, even when the trail is clear. Eleanor stood as well, gathering her mending once more. Of course. Good night, Noah. As she climbed to the loft, she found herself smiling slightly at the domesticity of the exchange. For a brief moment, it had felt almost normal, this quiet conversation by firelight, this mutual concern and accommodation of each other's needs, almost as if they were... Eleanor cut the thought short, unsettled by its direction. They were not a family, not anything more than strangers thrown together by desperate circumstance. That Noah had shown unexpected kindness, that he had offered this additional assistance with her sister. These things spoke to his character, not to any particular regard for her. And yet, as she settled beneath the heavy furs in the loft, listening to the soft sounds of Noah moving about the cabin below, banking the fire for the night, checking that the door was securely latched, she couldn't quite suppress the warmth that had kindled in her chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the growing awareness that Noah Bennett was a better man than his gruff exterior suggested, a man whose careful distance might protect more than just his privacy, but a heart that had known its share of loss. The morning dawned clear and cold, the sky a crystalline blue that promised good weather for Noah's journey. Eleanor rose early, determined to help prepare for his departure in whatever way she could. She found him already awake, packing a small satchel with provisions for the day's travel. I've made breakfast, she said, nodding toward the pot of porridge simmering over the fire. And there's coffee. Noah looked up, seemingly surprised by the simple gesture. Thank you, he said, the words still coming awkwardly to his lips, as if gratitude were a language he had forgotten how to speak fluently. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by Grace's sleepy questions when she finally woke and joined them at the table. She had accepted the news of Noah's impending journey with a child's mix of curiosity and concern. Will you see people in the town? She asked, spooning porridge into her mouth. Real people, not just animals? The question might have sounded impertinent coming from an adult, but from Grace, it was merely the honest inquiry of a child who had spent her life in a small community, surrounded by neighbors and extended family. A few, Noah replied, his tone gentler than Eleanor had come to expect when addressing Grace directly. The shopkeeper, maybe the preacher. Will you tell them about us? Grace asked. Noah glanced at Eleanor, a silent confirmation of their agreement from the night before. No, he said firmly, that's private business. Grace nodded, accepting this answer with the same solemn consideration she gave to all Noah's pronouncements. Will you be back before dark? Mama says the mountain is dangerous at night. Planning on it, Noah assured her, and Timber will stay with you. Keep watch. At the mention of his name, the dog raised his head from his place by the fire. Ears perked attentively. Noah addressed him directly. You're on guard duty today. Understand? Timber's tail thumped against the floorboards as if acknowledging the assignment. Eleanor smiled at the exchange, touched by Noah's effort to reassure Grace in his own way. As the time for departure approached, Eleanor found herself growing unexpectedly anxious. The rational part of her mind knew that Noah was more than capable of navigating the treacherous winter landscape. He had survived years in these mountains, through storms far worse than anything currently threatening, and yet the thought of him facing those dangers alone, partly on her behalf, left her uneasy. "I've written a letter to my sister," she said, handing him a folded paper. "I kept it brief, just letting her know we're safe and will come in spring." Noah tucked the letter into an inner pocket of his coat. "I'll see it delivered," he promised. "Be careful," Eleanor added, the words escaping before she could consider their implication, that she had any right to concern herself with his welfare, that his safe return mattered to her more than simple pragmatism would dictate. Something flickered in Noah's dark eyes, surprise perhaps, or something less easily named. "Always am," he said quietly. With that, he shouldered his pack, checked his rifle, and moved to the door. Timber rose to follow, but Noah gestured for the dog to stay. "Not this time, old friend," he said. "You've got work here." Eleanor and Grace stood in the doorway, watching as Noah made his way through the deep snow toward the trees. Just before he disappeared into the forest, he turned, raising a hand in a brief farewell. Eleanor lifted her own in response, a strange tightness in her chest as his figure was swallowed by the shadowed pines. The day stretched before them, suddenly emptier, without Noah's solid presence. Eleanor busied herself with household tasks, cleaning, mending, preparing a stew that would keep until Noah's return. Grace divided her time between helping her mother and entertaining Timber, who seemed content to remain close to the child, as if understanding his assigned duty. As dusk approached, Eleanor found herself increasingly drawn to the window, scanning the tree line for any sign of Noah's return. She told herself it was merely practical concern. If something had happened to him, their own situation would become precarious. But the anxiety that tightened her throat felt more personal than pragmatic. "He's not back yet," Grace observed, joining Eleanor at the window as the last light faded from the sky. "It's getting dark." "He'll be back soon," Eleanor assured her, hoping she sounded more confident than she felt. "The journey takes time, especially in snow." "What if he got hurt?" Grace asked, voicing the fear Eleanor had been trying to suppress. "Like when the mountain lion got him?" "Mr. Bennett is very experienced," Eleanor said firmly, "and he has his rifle this time. He'll be fine." But as true darkness fell and the temperature dropped precipitously, Eleanor's certainty wavered. She kept the fire built high, a beacon against the gathering night. Timber grew increasingly restless, moving from his place by Grace's side to the door and back again. Ears pricked toward the forest, as if listening for sounds beyond human hearing. "Something's wrong," Grace whispered, watching the dog's agitation. "Timber knows." Eleanor was about to offer another reassurance when Timber suddenly barked, a sharp, authoritative sound that made them both jump. The dog moved to the door, scratching at it insistently. Heart pounding, Eleanor hurried to open it. Cold air rushed in, along with a swirl of snowflakes that had begun to fall as night deepened. Timber shot out into the darkness without hesitation, disappearing into the swirling white. "Timber!" Grace called after him, distressed. Eleanor peered into the night, straining to see through the thickening snow. Nothing moved in the clearing save the falling flakes, illuminated by the light spilling from the cabin door. "Come inside, Gracie," she said, drawing her daughter back from the threshold. "It's too cold to leave the door open." "But Timber, he'll be back," Eleanor said, hoping it was true. "And so will Mr. Bennett." But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and the hour grew longer still, Eleanor's confidence waned. The snow was falling faster now, driven by a rising wind that moaned around the cabin's eaves. If Noah was still on the mountain, still trying to make his way home in these conditions. "We should go look for him," Grace said, as if reading her thoughts. "He might be hurt." "We can't, Gracie," Eleanor said gently. "We don't know the mountain. We'd only get lost ourselves." "Then what do we do?" Grace asked, her small face pinched with worry. Eleanor wished she had an answer that would reassure her daughter. In truth, there was nothing they could do but wait and hope, two actions that had never come easily to her. She was a woman accustomed to taking matters into her own hands, to finding solutions rather than accepting circumstances. But here, in this wilderness, against the implacable force of nature, she was powerless. Just as she was about to suggest, Grace tried to sleep, an unlikely prospect given their shared anxiety. A sound penetrated the howl of the wind. A bark, distant but unmistakable. Timber. Eleanor rushed to the door, throwing it open despite the blast of cold air. She peered into the swirling snow, heart hammering against her ribs. For several long moments, she saw nothing. Then, emerging from the white void like apparitions, two figures materialized, one four-legged leading the way, the other human, moving with the slow, deliberate steps of exhaustion. "Noah!" she called, relief flooding through her with such force it nearly buckled her knees. The figure raised its head at her voice, and Eleanor could just make out Noah's face beneath the rim of his snow-crusted hat. He was leading something behind him. A small sled, she realized, piled with supplies and nearly buried in fresh snow. Without hesitation, Eleanor plunged into the storm, wading through the deep snow toward him. As she drew closer, she could see the strain in his face, the way he leaned slightly to one side, the old injury no doubt protesting the day's exertion. "You should be inside," he said as she reached him, his voice rough with cold and fatigue. "So should you," she retorted, taking one side of the sled's rope. "Come on, almost there." Together, they pulled the sled the remaining distance to the cabin, where Grace waited anxiously in the doorway. Timber bounded ahead, shaking snow from his coat as he entered the warmth. Noah followed more slowly, each step clearly an effort of will. Once inside, Eleanor helped him remove his ice-encrusted coat and hat, noting with alarm how pale his face was beneath his beard, how his hands trembled slightly with cold and exhaustion. "You're frozen through," she said, guiding him to the chair nearest the fire. "Grace, fetch the willow bark tea, please." Noah didn't protest, which worried Eleanor more than any outward sign of injury might have. He simply sank into the chair, extending his hands toward the flames. Timber positioned himself at Noah's feet, looking up at his master with an expression Eleanor could only describe as reproach. "I know, old friend," Noah murmured. "Poor judgment on my part." "What happened?" Eleanor asked, kneeling to help remove his snow-packed boots. Noah grimaced, whether from pain or the memory, she couldn't tell. "Storm came faster than I expected. Should have stayed in Oak Ridge overnight, but..." He trailed off, his gaze flickering. To Grace, who was carefully preparing the medicinal tea. "But you promised to return today," Eleanor finished for him, understanding all too well. "You risked yourself to keep your word." Noah shrugged, a slight movement that couldn't disguise the stiffness in his shoulders. "Made it, didn't I?" "Barely," Eleanor said, unable to keep the concern from her voice. "You could have frozen to death out there." "Wouldn't be the first time I've traveled in worse," Noah replied, though his usual stoicism seemed forced, a thin veneer over genuine exhaustion. Grace approached with the steaming cup of tea, offering it to Noah with both hands, her expression solemn. "Are you hurt, Mr. Noah?" she asked directly. Noah accepted the cup, his gaze softening as it met Grace's worried eyes. "No, little one," he said, and the gentleness in his voice caught Eleanor by surprise. "Just tired. The mountain makes you work for every step in winter." Grace nodded, accepting this explanation. "Timber was worried," she informed him seriously. He kept going, to the door. "Did he now?" Noah glanced at the dog, who had settled into a watchful pose beside his chair. Good to know someone was concerned about my old bones. The teasing note in his voice, so unusual for the taciturn Noah, drew a small smile from Grace. We were worried too, she said matter-of-factly. Mama kept looking out the window. The evening after Noah's return from Oak Ridge settled into a different kind of quiet than the nights before, one heavy with unspoken questions and a strange new intimacy born of shared concern. Eleanor finished preparing the rabbit stew, adding wild onions and herbs from Noah's carefully preserved stores. The rich aroma filled the cabin, mingling with the scent of damp wool as Noah's outer garments dried by the fire. Grace had overcome her initial shyness enough to keep up a steady stream of questions about Noah's journey to town. What did Oak Ridge look like in winter? Were there many people? Did he see any children? Noah answered each query with surprising patience, offering brief but thoughtful responses that gradually painted a picture of the settlement below. A collection of sturdy buildings clustered around a trading post, a church and a schoolhouse, with scattered homesteads spreading outward into sheltered valleys. Did you deliver Mama's letter? Grace asked, accepting a bowl of stew with both hands. Noah nodded, his color improved by warmth and food. Left it with a man heading to Willow Creek tomorrow? Storekeeper vouched for him as reliable? Then Aunt Sarah will know we're safe, Grace said with satisfaction. She'll know more than that, Noah remarked, breaking a piece of cornbread. Slip some money in with the letter, enough to put her mind at ease about your situation. Eleanor nearly dropped her spoon. You did what? Noah met her gaze steadily, unapologetic. Money from the chair, he explained. Preacher's wife paid. In advance. Thought your sister might need assurance you weren't in want. Eleanor stared at him, a complicated mixture of emotions rising in her chest. Gratitude competing with a fierce pride that had sustained her through Matthew's illness and death, through Richard's callous dismissal and their desperate flight. That was your money, she said finally. Your work, your pay. Noah shrugged slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at his overtaxed muscles. Money's just a tool, he said simply, like an axe or a knife. Useful when needed, not worth much otherwise. The statement was so utterly contrary to the grasping materialism Eleanor had witnessed in Richard and Harriet, their careful accounting of every penny, their bitter resentment of the portion of family land that had gone to Matthew, that she found herself momentarily speechless. Thank you, she managed at last, the words still awkward between them, but increasingly necessary. Your kindness is, she trailed off, unable to adequately express the depth of her gratitude without revealing more vulnerability than she was prepared to show. Noah acknowledged her thanks with a slight nod before turning his attention back to his meal, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional weight of the moment. Eleanor followed his lead, focusing on her stew, though her mind continued to turn over this latest evidence of Noah's unexpected generosity. As they ate, Eleanor noticed Noah occasionally reaching to massage his right side, the movement subtle but telling. The journey had clearly aggravated his old injury, taxing his body beyond what he would admit aloud. When they had finished their meal, she rose to clear the bowls, then moved purposefully to the shelf where the medicinal herbs were stored. What else besides willow bark? She asked, sorting through the dried plants. For the pain. Noah looked up, his expression guarded. Said I was fine. You didn't say any such thing, Eleanor countered calmly. And I've nursed enough injuries to recognize pain when I see it, however well hidden. She selected a bundle of what appeared to be arnica, raising it questioningly. This? For a moment she thought Noah would maintain his stoic denial. Then with a barely perceptible sigh, he nodded. That and the valerian root, small bundle tied with red string. Eleanor found the specified herb, pleased by this small surrender. She prepared a stronger medicinal tea than before, adding honey from Noah's carefully hoarded supply to make it more palatable. "This will help with sleep as well as pain," she said, handing him the steaming cup. Matthew found it effective when his leg troubled him most. Noah accepted the tea without protest. This time, a tacit acknowledgement of his need that felt significant in its own right. "Your husband," he said after a moment, his voice pitched low enough that Grace, now playing quietly with Timber by the fire, wouldn't overhear. "War injury?" The question, one of the few personal inquiries Noah had initiated, caught Eleanor by surprise. "Yes," she confirmed. "Chancellorsville, a Confederate shell struck near his position. The shrapnel tore through his thigh, shattered the bone." Noah's expression remained impassive, but something in his eyes suggested understanding beyond mere sympathy. "Union?" he asked simply. Eleanor nodded. 12th New York. He was proud of his service, even after she trailed off, unwilling to revisit the bitter aftermath, the months of fever and pain, the gradual realization that Matthew would never again work the land as he once had, the slow draining of their resources as his condition worsened. "Seen too many good men broken by that war," Noah said quietly. "On both sides." There was a personal quality to the statement that made Eleanor wonder. "Did you serve?" she asked carefully. Noah's gaze remained fixed on the fire. 8th Ohio, he said after a long pause. Antietam, Gettysburg. The names fell from his lips like stones, heavy with unnamed memories. Eleanor absorbed this new piece of Noah's history, finding that it fit with what she had observed of him: the disciplined self-reliance, the stoic endurance of hardship, the deep-seated wariness that suggested he had seen the worst of humanity and chosen solitude in its aftermath. "Matthew never spoke of the fighting," she said, "only of the men he'd served with, the small kindnesses they showed each other in terrible circumstances." "Wise of him," Noah replied. "Some things are better left unremembered." He took a long drink of the medicinal tea, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste beneath the honey. "Your husband sounds like a good man." "He was," Eleanor agreed softly. "Kind, patient. Even when the pain was at its worst, he never lost his gentleness." She looked down at her hands, remembering Matthew's final days, how those same hands had cooled his fevered brow, changed bandages that never seemed to staunch the slow seeping of infection, held his wasted fingers as his breathing grew more labored. "Grace has his eyes," she added, glancing toward her daughter, his quiet way of watching the world. Noah followed her gaze, studying Grace with newfound understanding. "Hard for a child," he observed, "losing a father so young." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "though she's shown remarkable strength, more than I sometimes feel myself." The admission of weakness, of struggle, was not one Eleanor would have made to many. But here, in the warmth of the cabin, with the storm howling outside and Noah's steady presence beside her, the words came more easily than she would have expected. "Strength isn't about not feeling pain," Noah said after a thoughtful silence. "It's about continuing despite it." The insight, delivered in Noah's characteristically straightforward manner, touched Eleanor deeply. It articulated something she had felt but never expressed: that her daily perseverance, her relentless efforts to protect Grace and forge a path forward, constituted their own kind of courage, however inadequate they sometimes felt. "By that measure, you're one of the strongest men I've ever met," she observed. Noah looked momentarily taken aback, as if unused to having his own philosophies applied to himself. He offered no response beyond a slight incline of his head. But Eleanor sensed her words had landed somewhere meaningful. They lapsed into comfortable silence, the crackling fire and the occasional soft murmur of Grace speaking to Timber, the only sounds in the cabin. Outside, the storm had intensified again, wind driving snow against the windows with increasing force. Eleanor found herself profoundly grateful for the solid walls around them, for the steady warmth of the hearth, and, unexpectedly, for the quiet company of the man beside her. "Mama," Grace called, interrupting her thoughts, "come see what Timber can do." Eleanor rose, moving to where her daughter sat on the floor beside the watchful dog. Grace had arranged a series of small wooden animals, carvings Noah had evidently made for her at some point, in a circle around Timber. "Watch," Grace instructed, picking up a carved rabbit. "Timber, find the rabbit." To Eleanor's surprise, the dog immediately nudged the wooden rabbit with his nose, then looked up at Grace expectantly. "Good boy," Grace praised, offering a small piece of dried meat as reward. "Now find the fox." Again, Timber selected the correct animal from the arrangement, earning another treat and Grace's delighted approval. "Mr. Noah taught him," Grace explained, beaming with pride at the dog's performance. "He knows all the animals." Eleanor glanced at Noah, who watched the interaction with what might almost have been a smile softening his bearded face. "When did you have time to teach her this?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious. Noah shrugged slightly. "Days you've been busy with household tasks," she asked about the carvings. Seemed a way to pass the time. The revelation that Noah had been spending time with Grace, teaching her and Timber this simple game while Eleanor was occupied elsewhere, touched her unexpectedly. She had been so focused on their practical survival, on maintaining boundaries and independence within their forced proximity, that she had missed this growing connection between her daughter and their reluctant host. "Thank you," she said simply. "It's good to see her playing again." Noah nodded, his gaze still on Grace as she continued the game with Timber. "Children are resilient," he observed, "more so than we give them credit for." There was something in his tone, a shadow of old pain beneath the simple statement that made Eleanor wonder again about the mysterious wife whose clothes she now wore, about the possibility of a child that Grace had mentioned seeing in a photograph. She wanted to ask, to bridge this final gap in her understanding of Noah Bennett, but she hesitated, uncertain if such a direct inquiry would be welcome or would merely drive him back behind his walls of silence. Grace solved the dilemma for her, with the innocent directness only a child could manage. "Mr. Noah," she said, looking up from her game, "did you have a little boy once, like in the picture?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples of sudden tension outward. Noah went completely still, his expression shuttering so completely that for a moment he appeared carved from the same wood as his, Raven's. Eleanor moved quickly to intervene. "Grace," she began, a note of gentle reproof in her voice. "Remember what we discussed about—" "It's all right," Noah interrupted, his voice roughened but controlled. "No harm in asking." He looked directly at Grace, his dark eyes solemn. "Yes, I had a son once and a wife." Grace nodded, accepting this confirmation with unchildlike gravity. "What were their names?" she asked softly. Noah was silent for so long that Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "Catherine. My wife's name was Catherine. My son was Samuel." "Those are nice names," Grace said simply. Then, with the piercing insight children sometimes possess, she added, "You miss them a lot." It wasn't a question, and Noah didn't treat it as one. He merely nodded once, a short, sharp movement that conveyed volumes. "Where did they go?" Grace persisted, and this time Eleanor did intervene. "Gracie," she said firmly, "that's enough questions for tonight. It's well past your bedtime." To her surprise, Noah raised a hand slightly. "It's all right," he said again, though the words seemed to cost him something. He looked at Grace, his expression somber but not angry. "They died, little one, a long time ago." Grace absorbed, This information with a small, sad nod. Like my papa. Yes, Noah agreed. Like your papa. Eleanor's throat tightened at the simple exchange, at the shared understanding of loss that bridged the gap between this solitary mountain man and her young daughter. She moved to Grace's side, gently gathering the wooden animals. "Time for bed now," she said, helping Grace to her feet. "Say goodnight to Mr. Noah and Timber." Grace dutifully wished them both good night, then allowed Eleanor to guide her to the bed in the corner. As Eleanor tucked the furs around her daughter, she noticed Noah rise from his chair and move quietly to the cabin door. He slipped outside without a word, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor waited until Grace's breathing had evened, into sleep before she followed, wrapping the woolen shawl tightly around her shoulders against the bitter cold. She found Noah standing on the small porch, looking out at the swirling snow, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "You shouldn't be out in this cold," she said softly, moving to stand beside him. Noah didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the dark shapes of trees barely visible through the falling snow. "Needed air," he said simply. Eleanor understood. Some memories required space, could not be contained within four walls, however sturdy. They stood in silence for a long moment, the cold biting at Eleanor's exposed skin, but she made no move to return inside. "I'm sorry," she said finally. For Grace's questions. "Children don't always understand when a subject is painful." Noah shook his head slightly. "No apology needed. She's just curious. Natural at her age." "Still," Eleanor persisted, "you've opened your home to us, shared your food, your fire. You shouldn't have to share your grief as well." Noah was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not respond. When he did, his voice was low, almost lost beneath the moan of the wind. "Been 12 years, he said. "Sometimes feels like yesterday. Sometimes feels like another life entirely." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more he needed to say, unwilling to break the fragile moment with words of her own. "Scarlet fever," Noah continued after a moment, "took half the children in our settlement. Catherine tried to help the sick families, brought it home to Samuel." His hands tightened on the porch railing. "By the time I realized how ill they were, it was too late. Doctor couldn't do anything, just watch them slip away, one after the other." The stark recounting, delivered without embellishment or self-pity, struck Eleanor with terrible force. She thought of her own fear during Matthew's illness, the desperate hope that had sustained her even as rational thought told her his infection was beyond healing. At least she'd had time to prepare, to say goodbye. Noah's loss had been swift and merciless, a double blow from which few would fully recover. "That's why you live here," she said softly. "Away from everyone." Noah nodded once. "Couldn't stay. There, too many memories. Too many well-meaning people with their condolences and their casseroles and their certainty that time heals all wounds." A bitter note entered his voice. "Some wounds don't heal. They just scab over, still bleed when the weather changes." Eleanor understood this truth too well. How grief became a quiet companion rather than a passing visitor. How it shifted and changed, but never truly departed. She had felt Matthew's absence like a physical thing, a space beside her that no one else could fill. "After Matthew died," she said carefully, "people told me I would eventually find someone else, that I was still young, that I shouldn't spend my life alone." She wrapped her arms more tightly around herself, though the chill she felt came from within rather than without. As if Matthew were a glove I'd lost, easily replaced by another that fit well enough. Noah looked at her then, something like recognition in his dark eyes. "They don't understand." "No," Eleanor agreed softly, "they don't." They stood together in silence, two people who had navigated the treacherous waters of profound loss, who understood the cost of continuing when part of your heart had been irretrievably claimed by death. The snow fell around them, muffling the world, creating a private space in which grief could be acknowledged without judgment or expectation of recovery. "We should go in," Noah said eventually, his practical nature reasserting itself. "Too cold to stand out here reminiscing." Eleanor nodded, recognizing the shift in his tone as a signal that the moment of unusual openness had passed. Yet something had changed between them. A barrier breached, a deeper understanding established. As they returned to the warmth of the cabin, she felt the distance between them had diminished, though whether that was a comfort or a complication remained to be seen. Grace was still sleeping peacefully, timber now curled protectively at her feet. Noah checked the fire, adding another log to ensure it would burn through the night. His movements were measured and deliberate, but Eleanor could see the stiffness in his shoulders, the careful way he favored his right side. "The tea helped?" she asked, nodding toward his injured side. Noah glanced at her, a flicker of surprise crossing his features at her continued concern. "Some," he admitted. "Better than nothing." "I could prepare more," Eleanor offered. "Or perhaps—" She hesitated, uncertain if her suggestion would cross some invisible boundary. "A warm compress might help. I used to make them for Matthew when the pain was worst." Noah seemed to consider this, weighing discomfort against pride. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Wouldn't hurt to try." Eleanor set water to heat, then gathered clean cloths from her small store of belongings. As the water warmed, she added a pinch of the dried arnica, letting it steep into the liquid. Noah watched her preparations with interest. "Your grandmother taught you this?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, wringing out the excess water from the cloth. "She was a midwife," she explained. "Knew more about healing than most doctors, though they'd never admit it. Taught me what she could before she passed." "Useful knowledge," Noah observed, "especially out here where doctors are scarce." "It saved Matthew considerable suffering," Eleanor said, approaching with the warm compress. "Though not enough in the end." Noah met her gaze, understanding in his eyes. "Not your fault," he said quietly. "Some things can't be fixed, no matter how much we wish otherwise." The simple absolution, for it was that, a release from the guilt that had haunted Eleanor since Matthew's death, touched her deeply. She had done everything possible, had exhausted their resources and her own strength in trying to save him. That it hadn't been enough was a truth she was still learning to accept. "Thank you for that," she said softly. She held up the compress. "This needs to go directly on the injury. I can turn away if you prefer to do it yourself." For a moment, Noah looked as if he might choose that option. Then, with a slight shake of his head, he began to unbutton his shirt. "Probably best if you do it," he said. "Can't reach it properly myself." Eleanor kept her expression professionally neutral as Noah removed his shirt, revealing a torso marked by years of hard physical labor and the scars of a life lived without caution. The most prominent was the one that traversed his right side, a jagged line that began just below his ribs and curved toward his back, puckered and white with age, but still visibly deep. "Mountain lion did that?" she asked, unable to hide her shock at the severity of the wound. Noah nodded grimly. "Got careless, paid the price." Eleanor approached with the compress, her nurse's eye assessing the old injury with clinical detachment. The scar tissue was extensive, suggesting the wound had indeed been life-threatening. That Noah had treated it himself, had survived without proper medical care, was testament to his remarkable fortitude. "This will be warm," she warned, before gently placing the compress against his side. Noah inhaled sharply, but didn't flinch. Away from her touch, his skin was warm beneath her fingers, the muscles taut with tension. Eleanor maintained a careful pressure allowing the heat and the herbal infusion to penetrate the damaged tissue. The muscles around the scar tighten. In cold weather, she observed. That's what causes much of the pain, I imagine. Noah nodded. Gets worse each winter, he admitted. Used to be just an ache. Now it's like fire under the skin when I push too hard. You pushed too hard today, Eleanor said, unable to keep a note of gentle reproof from her voice. You should have stayed in Oak Ridge until the storm passed. Noah's mouth quirked in what might have been a reluctant smile. Probably, he conceded, but I gave my word I'd return. To whom? Eleanor asked. Grace and I would have understood if you'd been delayed by weather. Noah was silent for a moment, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. To myself, he said finally, said I'd be back, meant to keep that promise. The simple statement, delivered without dramatics, nonetheless carried a weight that Eleanor felt in her very bones. Noah Bennett was a man who kept his word, whatever the cost to himself. It was a quality she had seen in Matthew, a steadfast reliability that had drawn her to him despite her parents' concerns about his prospects. Well, she said, breaking the sudden tension between them, next time, consider that your word might be kept just as well with a day's delay as with risking yourself in a blizzard. Noah's almost smile deepened slightly. Noted, he said dryly. Eleanor removed the compress, which had begun to cool. I'll make another, she said, turning back to the hearth. As she prepared the second application, she felt Noah's gaze on her, thoughtful and assessing. You're good at this, he observed. The healing. Eleanor shrugged slightly. Necessity teaches quickly, she replied. Between grandmother's lessons and Matthew's long illness, I had ample opportunity to practice. Ever think of pursuing it? Noah asked. Formally, I mean. There are women doctors now, I hear. The question caught Eleanor by surprise. Few men of her acquaintance would have suggested such a thing, would have imagined a woman might harbor ambitions beyond hearth and home. Sometimes, she admitted, wringing out the fresh compress. Before Grace was born, I considered it. But then Matthew's injury changed our circumstances, and later she trailed off with a small, resigned gesture. Life unfolds as it will, not as we plan. Noah nodded, accepting this philosophy. Still, he said as she returned with the compress, never too late to consider new paths. Once spring comes. The reminder of their temporary arrangement, that this strange, suspended existence in Noah's cabin was merely a way station on a journey that would resume with the thaw, sent an unexpected pang through Eleanor's chest. She had been so focused on surviving the immediate crisis that she had given little thought to what would follow. Yes, she agreed, her voice steadier than her suddenly conflicted emotions. Once spring comes. She applied the second compress, with the same careful pressure as before, noting with satisfaction that some of the tension had already eased from Noah's muscles. His breathing was deeper, more regular, suggesting the pain had indeed diminished. The valerian will help you. Sleep, she said, stepping back. You should rest now, give your body time to recover. Noah nodded, reaching for his shirt. As he buttoned it, his movements less stiff than before, he glanced toward the bed where Grace slept peacefully, Timber maintaining his vigilant position at her feet. Your daughter, he said quietly. She has a generous heart. Sees more than most. Too much sometimes, Eleanor agreed with a small smile. She's always been unusually perceptive. It worries me occasionally how deeply she feels things, how quickly she attaches herself to people and places. Not a bad quality, Noah observed, in a world that often lacks such openness. No, Eleanor agreed, though it makes her vulnerable to disappointment. Noah was silent for a moment, his gaze still on the sleeping child. Samuel would have been about her age now, he said suddenly. 12 years, nearly 13. The admission, so personal, so freely given, caught Eleanor off guard. She met Noah's gaze, seeing in it a mixture of old pain and something new, a tentative reaching out, perhaps, an acknowledgement of connection that he had long denied himself. "I'm sorry," she said softly, the words inadequate but sincere. Noah nodded once, accepting her sympathy without the defensive withdrawal she had come to expect. "Been a long time since I spoke their names aloud," he admitted. "Catherine, Samuel." He tested the syllables as if remembering how they felt on his tongue, thought it would hurt more than it does. "Sometimes remembering is a kind of healing," Eleanor offered, "keeping them alive in words, in stories." "Maybe," Noah allowed. His expression softened slightly. "Catherine would have liked you. She had the same practical approach to problems, same stubborn streak too." Eleanor smiled at this unexpected comparison. "I believe I'll take that as a compliment." "It was meant as one," Noah assured her. He moved toward his customary sleeping place near the hearth, gathering the blankets. "He used as a pallet. Should get some rest. Morning comes early, storm or no storm." Eleanor nodded, understanding the conversation had reached its natural conclusion. She gathered her mending, preparing to retire to the loft. As she reached the ladder, she paused, looking back at Noah. "Thank you," she said softly, "for sharing them with me, Catherine and Samuel." Noah met her gaze across the dimly lit cabin, his expression unguarded in a way she had not seen before. "Thank you for listening," he replied simply. "Been too long since I had someone who would." With that, he settled onto his pallet, pulling a blanket over himself with the efficiency of long practice. Eleanor climbed to the loft, her mind filled with the revelations of the evening. Noah's losses, his unexpected openness, the gentle way he had spoken of her daughter's generous heart. She lay beneath the warm furs, listening to the storm's fury gradually diminishing outside, replaced by the deep silence that followed heavy snowfall. Something had shifted between them tonight, a change as subtle yet significant as the first. Faint signs of approaching spring beneath winter's dominion. Eleanor wasn't certain what it meant or where it might lead, but as she drifted towards sleep, she found herself less troubled by their dependency, more comfortable with the strange intimacy that had developed in this isolated cabin, far from the judgments and expectations of the world below. Outside, the clouds parted briefly, allowing moonlight to spill across the snow-covered clearing. Inside, 3 unlikely companions slept beneath the same roof, their breaths rising and falling in the quiet rhythm of shared existence. And somewhere, in the vast wilderness that separated them from the rest of humanity, a new path was forming, one none of them had anticipated, but which now seemed increasingly possible with each passing day. February arrived with a brutal cold that tested even Noah's weathered cabin. Frost patterns etched the windows like delicate lace, and the wind found new ways to whisper through imperceptible gaps in the log walls. The world outside had narrowed to an endless expanse of white, broken only by the dark silhouettes of pine trees and the occasional tracks of wildlife, brave enough to venture across the snow-laden clearing. Inside, life had settled into a rhythm neither Eleanor nor Noah could have anticipated when fate first thrust them together. Eleanor had mastered the art of stretching their provisions, creating hearty meals from the game Noah trapped and the stores he had laid in before winter's arrival. Grace had flourished despite their isolation, her natural resilience and curiosity finding outlet in the small daily adventures Noah unexpectedly provided. Learning to identify animal tracks in the snow, helping to cure rabbit pelts, watching as he transformed simple blocks of wood into intricate carvings that seemed to capture the very essence of the forest creatures. Most surprising to Eleanor was the gradual transformation in Noah himself. The taciturn mountain man, who had once fled from even the simplest personal conversation, now sat by the fire in the evenings, occasionally offering stories of his life. Before the mountain, his childhood in Ohio, his time as a soldier, even carefully measured memories of Catherine and Samuel that seemed to bring him solace rather than pain in the telling. This evening, Noah had returned earlier than usual from checking his trap lines. His cheeks ruddy with cold, but his movements relaxed, without the stiffness that often plagued him after hours in the bitter air. Eleanor looked up from the small carving she was working on, a simple bird that Noah had been teaching her to shape from a block of pine, and smiled in welcome. "Successful day?" she asked, setting aside her work. Noah nodded, hanging his coat and hat on their accustomed pegs. "2 rabbits and a fox," he confirmed. "Good thick winter coat on the fox. Should make fine trim for gloves." Grace looked up from where she sat on the floor with Timber, a book open on her lap, one of the few possessions Eleanor had managed to salvage from their hasty departure from Oak Ridge. "Can I help prepare the fox fur?" she asked eagerly. "Like you showed me with the rabbit." Noah's expression softened in the way it increasingly did when addressing Grace. "If your mother approves," he said, glancing at Eleanor. "The work's not too difficult, but it takes patience." "You've been remarkably patient with her endless questions," Eleanor observed with a smile. "I've no objection to her learning useful skills, provided she follows your instructions carefully." The scene was interrupted by a sharp, unexpected knock at the door. Timber rose immediately, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Noah motioned for Eleanor and Grace to move back, his expression instantly alert as he reached for his rifle. "Stay here," he said quietly, approaching the door with practiced caution. Reverend Thomas Parker from Oak Ridge stood on the porch with 2 young men, all half frozen from their journey to reach a dying woman in Pine Hollow. Caught in a squall and disoriented, they had spotted Noah's chimney smoke and sought shelter. Noah welcomed them inside, though Eleanor noted the wariness in his posture. Strangers meant questions, and questions about their living arrangement were bound to arise. As the Reverend warmed himself by the fire, his kind eyes took in the domestic scene before him. Eleanor, Noah, and Grace clearly settled into a comfortable routine that spoke of weeks spent in close quarters. Though he made no outward judgment, Eleanor sensed his thoughts. She was acutely aware of how their situation would appear to outsiders. A young widow, living unchaperoned, with an unmarried man in a remote cabin, her child in tow, the arrangement continuing indefinitely. Later that evening, as Jenkins, one of the Reverend's companions, played cheerful tunes on his fiddle, Reverend Parker asked Eleanor to dance. During their waltz, he spoke quietly of her predicament. "Your situation here is unusual," he said carefully. "I make no judgments. The circumstances were clearly beyond your control, and Mr. Bennett is known to be a man of honor. But when you return to civilization in spring, there may be those less charitable in their assessments." The gentle warning confirmed Eleanor's fears. "I'm aware of the potential for misunderstanding," she acknowledged, "though I had hoped the extreme nature of our circumstances might mitigate such judgments." "There is a solution," he suggested delicately. "A tradition among the mountain people, a winter marriage, a union formed out of necessity, with the understanding that when spring arrives, both parties may choose to either formalize the arrangement permanently or dissolve it without prejudice." The suggestion left Eleanor speechless. That night, after their guests had settled before the fire and Noah had insisted on sleeping in the stable, he sought her out on the porch under the brilliant mountain stars. "The Reverend spoke to me," Noah said without preamble, "about our situation." "He spoke to me as well," Eleanor admitted, "while we were dancing." "Suggested a winter marriage," Noah continued, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "What do you think?" Eleanor asked, the question emerging more vulnerable than she had intended. Noah considered carefully. "Think the Reverend makes a fair point about reputations, about how people talk." He glanced toward the cabin where Grace slept. "The child shouldn't suffer for circumstances not of her making." "And you?" she asked softly. "Would you be willing to enter such an arrangement, even temporarily?" Noah met her gaze directly. "Question isn't what I'm willing to do. It's what serves you and Grace best." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Though, I won't pretend the arrangement would be a hardship for me." The admission sent warmth through Eleanor, despite the freezing air. "Nor for me," she whispered. By morning, Eleanor had made her decision. She found Noah preparing coffee while there. Guests still slept. "If the offer still stands," she said quietly, "I would accept the arrangement the Reverend suggested." Something flickered in Noah's eyes, relief mixed with something warmer. "You're certain? Not feeling obligated by circumstances?" "I'm certain," she confirmed. "It's a sensible solution that protects all our interests, and not an unwelcome one on personal grounds." The ceremony took place before the Reverend's departure, simple and practical. Grace accepted the news with surprising equanimity, observing that Noah kept them safe, which she thought her father would have approved of. As Eleanor spoke the vows that bound her to Noah, feeling his steady hand around hers, she found herself focusing less on the arrangement's temporary nature and more on the present reality, that they were choosing to face life's challenges together. Before departing, Reverend Parker offered Eleanor one piece of advice. "Don't allow the temporary nature of this arrangement to prevent you from fully inhabiting it. Sometimes what begins as necessity reveals itself as providence in disguise." That afternoon, as Eleanor watched Noah patiently teaching Grace how to prepare the fox fur, she contemplated their unusual journey. Whatever name society might give to their arrangement, winter marriage, marriage of convenience, temporary union, the reality before her eyes was simple and profound. They had become a family, forged in the crucible of winter's isolation and necessity's demands. As if sensing her thoughts, Noah looked up, meeting her gaze across the cabin. The smile that briefly crossed his features, private, genuine, tinged with something that might have been hope, warmed Eleanor more thoroughly than the blazing hearth. She returned it without hesitation, accepting what the day had brought and what the future might hold with equal measures of pragmatism and newly awakened hope. Outside, winter maintained its grip on the mountain, but within the cabin's sturdy walls, something new had begun to blossom. As resilient and unexpected as the first crocuses that would eventually push through the snow when spring finally came. To Raven's Peak. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.